Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here today and to share in your missions focus for the last two Sundays. Just a personal reflection. I've seen that video dozens of times, and when I saw it again this morning in the first service, something really connected with me again, and it was due to the fact that last weekend I was in Washington, D.C., where IJM has its annual prayer gathering called the Global Prayer Summit, and we had about 2,000 people gathered together to pray for these issues, to hear responses and answers to prayers that we prayed the previous year. And probably one of the highlights for me was on Friday evening, meeting someone that had been rescued by IJM. Her name is Cassie. She was someone who had been trafficked and exploited online through live streaming of that abuse. And she was rescued when she was 16 years old after having been with her trafficker for 4 years. And she then went into our aftercare program and was restored. She spoke of her great love for her Heavenly Father, who has restored to her an image of what a loving Father is. And then she led us in prayer to pray for other young boys and girls who are experiencing the same kind of exploitation and living as slaves, bound to these traffickers. And it was just so powerful to hear her in a very tiny but yet very strong and committed voice lead us in prayer, to pray for those who are still waiting for rescue to be actually rescued. And that first song that we sung this morning that said, "And the weak will lead the strong," that was to me a picture of how the weak actually accomplished this thing in God's kingdom. So this topic that we're going to be looking at today, the subject of the violent exploitation of the vulnerable in this world, is hard, but there is reason for us to be encouraged by what God is doing in the world today. I just also want to just say at the beginning, thank you to Lethbridge Free for your partnership with IJM and our work in Bolivia. You have made a significant contribution over the last 3 years to ending the sexual abuse and violence towards young boys and girls in the city of La Paz, Bolivia. I think you had Alejandra Camara, our lead attorney, with you a few years ago, and actually were able to meet one of our national staff leaders, and I just respect so much what Alejandra and her team are doing. But you've also been able to contribute in other ways. I believe Justice Dallas Miller, who's a part of this community, has helped us to get judges from Canada to be able to go to Bolivia, to train Bolivian judges in how to efficiently handle cases involving sexual abuse against children. For many, many years, the challenge in the court system in Bolivia was that many of these cases would take 5 to 7 years to finally get to the point of conviction or acquittal. And it was just taking too long. Many of the people that we were working with just gave up hope in that long process. And so through the training of judges and through creating some more efficient systems, those cases are proceeding much more quickly now, so that there actually can't be breaks of longer than 2 weeks between court appearances in these cases. And I believe some more judges from Canada are going down in April to do further training. And then you've got a team of bike riders here in this city who love to ride bikes all over the world and who raised awareness for IJM and support for IJM, and some of the folks are part of this community as well. And so just for your prayers and your support and your remembering IJM and our work in Bolivia, we just want to just say thank you so much to you for that. Well, today my message is making the road safe. We begin by looking at a very familiar story that Jesus told in response to a question, which was, "Who is my neighbor?" And the story that he tells is still actually referenced in our present day culture. People may not recognize it as actually something that Jesus said, but somebody who goes out of their way to help somebody in need or in distress is often referred to as a good Samaritan. And so the story that we heard earlier is a story that many of us probably heard as we were growing up in the church. Probably one of the first stories we hear in Sunday school. Now this will date me a little bit, but I remember that story being told through flannel graph. Anybody remember flannel graph? Okay, yes. That was back in the day before computer animation and all the fun stuff that you can do right now. But we saw this story of this man walking this road and being attacked and falling over, turning sideways on the flannel graph. But oftentimes in our familiarity with stories that we hear often, there's some key aspects in the story that might get overlooked or just might be seen as unimportant. And so I want to look at this story again with perhaps a new set of eyes to see what Jesus would have to say to us through this story today. In telling this story, Jesus was actually referencing a specific stretch of road that went from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was a 38-kilometer stretch of road that travelers walked down, and it was a road that was known for its danger. It was dangerous because of simply the geography. There's sheer drop-offs, and the terrain was kind of rugged. And as you see in the slide, it was, unless you like mountain biking and things like that, it'd probably be a place you may not want to go on for a Sunday stroll. But it was also known as the place where people would be attacked and robbed if they weren't careful, if they weren't traveling in groups. People would venture on this road in large groups so they could protect themselves from the thieves and robbers that would lay in wait for vulnerable people on the road. So when a traveler was going on this road alone, the hearers automatically would have gone, "Oh, bad choice. Shouldn't be doing that," because they knew this road was a dangerous road. So it must have been some kind of an emergency, or either the man just didn't know how dangerous this road was that he set off on this particular stretch of road. But then the scripture tells us that this man was assaulted. And actually, when you read the text, this wasn't just somebody being punched a couple of times and then pushed to the ground. It was a violent assault. He was stripped of his clothes. He was beaten. And it says that he was left for dead at the side of the road. So I don't quite know how to define left for dead, what that looks like, but it was a violent assault that caused this man to either be unconscious and left at the side of the road, looking like he may have died. Now, I don't remember that being depicted in the flannel graph stories that I saw in Sunday school. The teachers were a little bit more PG at that time, but there was an assault that took place that was quite vicious. But I think it speaks to something that I think we can identify with, and that is this, that we find violence repulsive. When newscasters are sharing a story in which they may show someone who is the victim of a violent crime, they will say things like, if you're disturbed by these images, you may want to look away. We don't like to look at the aftermath of violent activities. And so maybe with that understanding, when we see in the story the priest and the Levite walking by, taking a wide berth around this man who was left for dead at the side of the road, maybe we might have a little bit of an understanding if we placed ourselves in that picture of seeing someone maybe lying in a pool of blood, maybe with broken bones or dislocated limbs, and ask ourselves, would we step towards that aftermath of a violent act? How close would we get? I know the theme of your missions focus over these 2 Sundays is lifting your eyes. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I think there's also a time when we actually have to lower our eyes, to actually look at the brokenness that exists in our world, to not turn our eyes away from the things that we find repulsive just because we don't want to look at them or deal with them, because the God of justice that we serve, that we love, He sees this all the time. He looks down on this world and He sees those lying on the side of the road, left for dead, bloodied and bruised. And rather than avoiding, rather than finding this so repulsive that we don't want to engage, I think there's something that we are called to that actually is hard and challenging, but yet in a broken world, we must turn our eyes down to see those who live in this way. And at IJM, we're constantly forced to look at some of the most brutal and violent acts that human beings perpetrate on each other. And we do this because we know that the God of justice, who loves every one of these people that he created, sees them in their point of distress. And he doesn't want us to turn away, but actually to engage and to look at them. Well, Jesus then goes on to describe the hero of this story, the Samaritan, the person who was an outsider, who wouldn't be expected to stop and assist this person. And so he does, and he provides triage on the spot. He bandages the wounds of this man and then puts the man on his donkey, takes him to an inn where he then personally looks after this man at his own expense. But because of the severity of the man's wounds, he can't stay there. So he pays the innkeeper to look after this person that he found on the side of the road and says, any other expenses that are incurred, I'll come back and I'll cover them. And so then Jesus kind of turns this then on the people who asked him the question, who is my neighbor? And he says to them, now, after this, who do you think was the good neighbor? And the response from the text was, well, the one who showed mercy. You see, mercy always calls us to respond to the immediate distress or difficulty that someone around us is in. When we step towards someone who is in need, someone who has a challenge, someone who just needs a friend, somebody to talk to, when there's a problem and we step towards that, that's mercy in action. That's what mercy calls us to do. But as I've reflected on this story, there's another question that I think it would be good for us to consider, and that is this. At what point on this road of violence and injustice do we actually want to pause and say, how do we actually make this road safe for every traveler who ventures onto it? Now, Jesus, again, affirms that we need to respond to mercy, with mercy, to those who experience various kinds of abuse and difficulty and the effects of the sin in this world. We need to respond with mercy. But is it acceptable for us to continue to simply pick up the left for dead at the side of the road and bandage their wounds and do that over and over and over again without asking, how do we actually make this road safe? So that anyone who ventures onto this road can do so without the fear that they're going to be the next victim. They're going to be the next target. You see, Jesus did not just call us to mercy. He also called us to act justly. In Matthew 23, Jesus, in another conversation with the teachers of the law about what to bring to worship, he restates Micah 6:8, in which he says, these are the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Justice is a part of Jesus' work and activity that he calls us and invites us to in this world as well. In IJM's work in the developing world, we know that there are roads of violence that affect the lives of billions of people each and every day. The UN estimates that 4 billion people in this world live outside the protection of the rule of law. That means they're on roads where they're vulnerable because those who act with impunity, thinking nothing will ever happen to them if they rob, assault someone, do so on a day-to-day basis. In roads in India, Asia, Africa, South America, there are people who experience this kind of violence that Jesus was describing in this story. Like the case of the young girl in La Paz, Bolivia, who became a client of IJM. She took a taxi to school every day. And on one particular day, the taxi driver didn't take her to school. He took her to an alley and he sexually assaulted her. When IJM was referred this case, we came around her and her family to bring support, to bring healing, to show mercy so that she could be restored to a place of strength. But we also had our investigators go and find this man who perpetrated this crime on this young girl. And after time of investigation, weeks of investigation, we actually were able to find this taxi driver, and he was arrested and he's waiting trial now for his crime in Bolivia. We must continue to respond in mercy to those who on roads in life are victims of abuse and the sin of others. But we also have to lift our eyes and envision a time when these roads of injustice and violence can actually be made safe and transformed. And I want to encourage you this morning by telling you a couple of stories of things that IJM has seen in our work around the world. And the first story I want to tell you comes from Kolkata, India. This Google Earth image shows a stretch of road of about 500 meters near Kolkata, India. It's a major thoroughfare, actually a trucking route that travels, that truckers take back and forth in coming in and out of Kolkata. The dots that you see on the screen are actually brothels. So in a 500-meter stretch of road, there are approximately 20 brothels that exist. And our undercover investigators had identified this particular stretch of road as one in which minor children had been trafficked into. The next couple of slides just show you what these places actually look like. They're nothing fancy. At the front, there might be a little restaurant in which truckers would come in and have something to eat. But in the back rooms were these places where girls were just being held. And the customer would come in, make a deal with the owner of the facility, and then one of these girls would be taken to a private room where they'd be raped for the profit of their owner. Our investigative team knew that this kind of injustice and this kind of violence existed in this stretch of road. And so we began to work to address it. One of the girls that we met in our investigation is this girl, Mala. Mala, when she was 12 years old, went to work for a tailor in the village that her family was in. Her family needed her to work to bring in income, so she worked for a tailor. And after about a year, her boss, which was a woman, said, Mala, we need to go to Kolkata. We need to go and get some thread and some fabric, and so would you please come with me to Kolkata? And so they went on this trip, and it required a stay overnight, and so Mala thought they were staying at a hotel, only to wake up the next morning to find that her boss had sold her to a trafficker who owned one of the brothels that actually they had been staying in. Now, the owner of this brothel was this man. His name is Nakul Bera. He owned 7 of the brothels in that stretch of road. And our investigators had found that he actually was the main trafficker of young girls from rural Nepal and Bangladesh, and he brought them into his brothels, but also trafficked them to some of the other establishments in that area. He was very wealthy, and so he had paid off many of the local officials and actually bragged about the fact that he could operate his business, which was against the law, without any fear of involvement because he'd paid off local police and other authorities in the community. And so when IJM began our investigative work and we encountered Mala, and she desperately told us how she wanted to be out of this place. She became our advocate in a sense in these brothels, and she was hoping and waiting for rescue. So our investigators gathered the evidence, took it to local authorities. But on 7 occasions, when we tried to do rescue operations with local authorities, every time we came into one of these brothels, it was empty. The police had been tipped off. Or the police actually had been the ones who tipped off the owners so that when we came in, there were no minor children that were there. On one occasion, we actually saw them chasing some of the children out the back door into a field. So we knew that the local police were corrupt. So we had to go to the superintendent of police for the entire West Bengal area, the state police. And he was somebody that we had built relationship with, and he was very eager to help us to address this particular problem on this stretch of road. And so he came and brought his officers from the state police, and we were able to conduct a rescue operation, which we were able to rescue Mala and 17 other minors from those facilities. However, Mr. Bera was not on the premises when we were able to do this rescue operation. And he went into hiding because he now knew that all of his money and influence and stuff hadn't been able to protect him because there were others who wanted to see his operation shut down. We actually had to make this a matter of prayer for our prayer partners because he had gone into hiding and we didn't know exactly where he was, so we just asked our prayer community to begin to pray with us that we'd be able to find him. And 9 months after we initiated that prayer, request, Mr. Barrow was located. He was arrested and incarcerated. Now, there are rights that people have in justice systems around the world, and Mr. Barrow applied for bail soon after he was incarcerated. Actually, he applied for bail on 53 occasions. And sometimes our IJM lawyers had to travel 3 to 4 hours to go to a bail hearing in which Mr. Barrow was appealing to the judge to be given a release on bail. And in every occasion, our lawyers, sometimes only for 2 or 3 minutes, stood up and just shared why Mr. Barrow would be a flight risk. And in all 53 occasions, the judge agreed that Mr. Barrow should not be given a bail. And eventually he did stand trial, and he, along with 5 associates, were convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for their abuse and rape of young girls in those facilities. Now, this had an amazing impact in that community because this man thought he was untouchable. This man thought that he could act with impunity, that no one would ever stop him in these endeavors. But the judge actually ordered that the 7 brothels that he owned would be actually permanently closed. They actually shut down and padlocked and put a wax seal on that lock saying no one is ever going to use these facilities again to exploit children. Now, the other brothels are operational in that city because prostitution is legal in that part of India. But our investigators continue to go and to make sure that minors are not being trafficked and they're being offered to customers in these facilities. And the other brothel owners know because this one man was convicted. They know that people are watching and that children are no longer easily accessible for them to exploit. Now, that hard work of justice, I think, is something that we need to understand. Mercy calls us to respond in the moment to the need that we see. The work of justice is longer term. And that's why I love what Gary Haugen, the founder of IJM, says about this work of justice. He says this, he says, victims of injustice do not need our spasm of passion. They need our long obedience in the same direction. They need our legs and our lungs of endurance. This picture of Mala having come through the aftercare program that IJM was running. She stays in contact with our aftercare team. She's an adult now, so she has her own vocation. She's a manager of a beauty parlor, and she is thriving in her new freedom and with a sense of dignity and pride in what she can do. She gave testimony at Mr. Barrow's trial, courageously telling what happened to her as she was forced to service between 10 to 12 men a day. So this long obedience in the same direction, this commitment to build our legs and our lungs of endurance is something that we're called to. There's one more story that I want to share with you about the road where a road of violence is becoming safer, and that is in Cebu in the Philippines. Cebu is the second largest city in the Philippines. It's a tourist destination, but with that also there's an underside of that, and that is that there's a sex tourism destination as well in Cebu. It is known for that, and many people come from not only the Western world, but also from China and from Korea and other countries in Asia to Cebu to exploit, especially minor children. These are just, again, an undercover picture taken in one of the karaoke bars and nightclubs that existed in Cebu where people would come in and they'd look behind a glass wall and see people there that they would just choose a number and then take them off site where they were then exploited. When IJM began its work in the Philippines, our field office started with a grant from the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation gave a significant grant to IJM to actually look at how we could combat the sexual exploitation of minor children in Cebu. And if you know anything about the Gates Foundation, they are great at measuring everything. When they give money to a project, whether it be AIDS reduction or education or this project that they gave to IJM to support, they measure what what is the foundation, the baseline, and then any change that would come from it. They want to know what works and what doesn't work. And so they sent in an independent group of investigators to do this baseline study, to determine how many children were being offered in the commercial sex trade in Cebu. They began to look at the number of establishments that were offering minor children. And then they would just have their investigators talk to people on the streets, taxi drivers, people in the hotel industry, to see how soon they would be able to find someone who would be able to identify where children would be offered for exploitation. And when we first started our office, it was just under 2 hours that these investigators, it would take them to find someone who on the street could identify where children were available to be exploited. Well, IJM's role in this project was to actually work with the Philippine National Police Force to create a regional anti-trafficking task force. And our role was to recruit and to train this group of dedicated officers who would address this issue of exploitation of children in Cebu. Now, it took us 18 months to actually recruit and train them because we wanted to make sure that the people who actually would be part of this team were of the character and of the quality that they would not accept bribes from the owners of these establishments once they began doing investigations. So we had to vet those officers who were going to be a part of that. The next thing we had to do was train them in terms of how did they gather evidence that would then stand up in court, because once a trafficker was arrested, they too would have a day in court where they could defend themselves. And if the evidence that we gathered wasn't done in a correct way or in a proper way, then the case could be thrown out and the trafficker could go free if evidence hadn't been compiled in a proper way. So we spent 18 months just doing that kind of training. And then we began to do our rescue operations. So over the next 3 to 4 years, we were able to then rescue 225 minor children who had been exploited in Cebu. 78 traffickers were arraigned. That meant that the public prosecutor, felt there was enough evidence to proceed with trial that would hopefully result in convictions of these people. So the officers had done their job in gathering the evidence. So at the end of this project that the Gates Foundation funded, and our office still continues even though the funding from the Gates Foundation ended, the Gates Foundation sent in, again, independent investigators to, again, look at those things that they identified at the beginning of this project. And what they found was that it was now taking, on average, over 8 hours to find someone on the street, taxi drivers, people in the hotel industry, who knew where children could be accessed. There was a 73% reduction in the number of establishments that were offering minor children. When traffickers were arrested, oftentimes their property was confiscated as well. And so again, a message is sent to others who would think that they could act with impunity as they exploited these young children. When they saw other people being arrested, going to jail, having their property confiscated, it sent a message to those who thought they could just get away with this, that things were changing. When IJM began this study, we set as our goal to see a 20% reduction in the number of children being exploited in the commercial sex trade in Cebu. That was what we hoped to see as a result of this work. Well, at the end of this project, these independent investigators came back and actually said, you know what? It's 79% reduction in the number of children available to be exploited in the Metro Cebu area, in the commercial sex trade. Now, I think that's a miracle. I think that is outstanding. That in a place where children were subject to violence on a day-to-day basis, that we were seeing this kind of a shift. We shared this information with the Philippine government, and they were so enthralled by what we were able to do. They asked us to replicate this in 2 other cities, in Manila, and then also in a city called Pampanga in the northern part of the Philippines. And IJM continued to reproduce this model and to work to see this kind of change take place to protect children in the country of the Philippines. And in each of those cities, we saw significant reductions. Again, 79% in Cebu. In Manila, it was 75% reduction. And in Pampanga, it was an 86% reduction in the number of children over a 4 to 6 year period who were not being subject to this kind of abuse and violence. Now, I've told you 2 stories, and there are many more stories yet to be told about roads and streets that are becoming safer because God's people have lifted their eyes to see something that only faith will allow us to see. And that is these roads of violence and injustice transformed into roads that are now safe, where men and women and children can walk on those roads without fear of being harmed, of being enslaved, of being assaulted. Only people of faith can see that. Only people who know of a God who promises a kingdom of freedom for those who are oppressed. Good news to those who are in bondage or in prison. We know that this is a God who sees these places and whose heart breaks over them, but who says this isn't the final story. This isn't how it has to remain. We can actually see these places transformed. In Isaiah 58, verse 12, actually, the prophet Isaiah says this to the people of God. This is what God actually has destined us to do. He says, your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets and dwellings. Have you ever thought of yourself in that way? Or is this community thought of itself as a community that is to restore the streets of injustice and violence in this world to a place of peace and safety? I think too often our eyes remain on the brokenness in the world and we don't lift our eyes to see this kind of an image that God has presented to us about who He's called us to be. Restorer of streets and dwellings. So my challenge to you today here at Lethbridge E-Free Church is simply this. Which roads are you going to make safe? Now, as I've been sharing, you may have thought of particular streets and roads in your own community that you know are places of danger, of violence. If you're a police officer in this community, they're the places and the roads and the streets that you take more calls on than other places in the community. They might be places where you tell people you don't walk on those streets at night. You don't go there alone. You think God has a different plan, a different vision for those streets than just places to be avoided? And maybe it takes a community of faith who can actually look at those places in your own community and go, this isn't what God had ordered and desired for the people who live and walk on these streets to experience. He has something better, something more, something that's meant to bring life to them that we get to be a part of actually bringing in. The question is, do you have the legs and the lungs of endurance to actually see that become a reality? Perhaps you're reminded again of the many roads in the developing world where iJam is doing this long, hard work, and you are reminded again to pray for us and to engage with us. And we have some prayer cards at the back table, little cards like this. Particularly, they're all from Bolivia. Just cards of people that we are working with and we have helped that would be reminders for you to pray for us. But not just to pray for our office in iJam Bolivia. We really do ask for your prayers generally for the work that we do because our teams also live with the reality and the nearness of violence. In June of this year, my colleague, an iJam lawyer from Nairobi, Kenya, Willie Kimani, along with one of our clients and the driver of the vehicle that they were in, were abducted, were tortured, and then ultimately murdered, their bodies thrown into a river outside of Nairobi. Mr. Kimani, Willie, had been defending our client in a case involving the police abuse of power. Our client had been charged with crimes he did not commit. He was actually shot by a police officer for no apparent reason. And they had just gone to court to present the opening arguments in the trial that pertained to this client of ours. And they were being driven back by by this driver that we have that was driving them back to our IGM offices. When they were stopped at an intersection, they were grabbed out of their vehicles, thrown into another vehicle, and driven then to a police compound where witnesses said that was the last time they saw these men alive. The trial for the 5 officers, police officers, who were charged in the murder of these 3 men is ongoing right now. Actually, tomorrow, Monday morning, it will begin again. And for the next 4 to 5 weeks, that trial will continue in Nairobi. And we ask that you would pray with us that justice would be done. Because this is a tipping point in the country of Kenya. You see, police in that country have been acting as if they were above the law, to extort, to abuse their power, to gain from those that don't have any power, to operate outside of the rule of law. That has been the way that things have been operating. And we believe that this could be the tipping point if police officers are actually held accountable to the rule of law, that this could be the tipping point for a brand new justice system transformation in the country of Kenya. So we walk these roads as well, and my colleagues live this on a daily basis. And so we desire for you to pray with us, that we would continue to be strong and courageous as we work to bring about safety on these roads in the places that we work. So my prayer, my call, my challenge to you as a community is to develop those legs and those lungs of endurance, to do the work of justice, to respond in mercy to the immediate needs that you will encounter, but then to build that spiritual muscle, to do the work that will result in roads becoming safe in your community here and around the world. I want to conclude by reading a blessing that I think will encourage all of us in this long obedience in the same direction. It says this: may God bless us with discomfort at easy answers, half truths, and superficial relationships so that we may live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. And may God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And may God bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make the difference in this world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and to the poor. Amen.